Today, we're in week 5 of a series that we've entitled Overcoming Obstacles. And so I'm just going to ask a question this morning. And this is a question, it's like when you come to church, you just want to be happy. And this is going to be a question that you're going to go, oh, we're not talking about happiness today. Nope. You ready for your question? How do you handle seasons of life that you wouldn't have chosen for your life? Right? Let that sink in for a moment. Seasons of your life that you didn't choose, like, oh, I don't want to be in this season of suffering, but here I find myself in this season of suffering. And so what are we going to learn when we walk through these seasons, when we walk through these trials and these struggles? I don't know if you've ever heard of a man by the name of John Bunyan. I just want to share with you just a little bit of his life. In the 1600s, he was a Baptist minister, and he felt like God called him to preach the gospel. And so that's exactly what he did. But in England in the 1600s, it was illegal to preach outside of the state-ran church. So they had churches, but the state was in control of them, and they said, you can preach, but you preach in the confines of this facility and nowhere else. And John was like, that's not me. That's not what God has asked me to do. And so he would go out into the streets, and he would preach. Well, it was illegal. If you do something illegal, you can be arrested. And so for sure, he went out knowing there would be consequences for his actions. He went out to the streets and he preached about Jesus. He was arrested and he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Before he went to prison, his first wife, died while giving birth to their 4th child. And right before he went into prison, he married his second wife. And while in prison, his second wife had a miscarriage. And so now you have a woman who doesn't have her husband, who's taking care of 4 children that she did not birth while just losing a child. And her husband is in prison for 12 years for preaching about Jesus. Now, I don't know about you, but that feels like more than a season of suffering. That feels like long suffering. But while in prison, John began to write the first part of a book. Now, you may have heard of this book, you may have read this book, and it's called Pilgrim's Progress. After he's released from prison, this book sells over 100,000 copies. And I don't know about you, but that's a lot of books, right? Hundreds of years ago. That's a lot of books. Because those books were published and sold, he was able to take care of his family. Not only did he take care of his family, it created opportunities for him to be able to preach the gospel outside the 4 walls of the church. I don't know if he realized it in that season of suffering that God was going to use it to advance the kingdom, but he left a legacy because in the darkest season of his life, he found hope. Now, you look at that and you're like, man, are we still talking about it today? Well, actually, Pilgrim's Progress has sold 250 million copies year to date. The only book that has ever sold more copies is the Bible. That's it, right? So you have somebody who is imprisoned for preaching the gospel, but while in prison finds a purpose, writes a book that we're still talking about today, and has sold 250 million copies. So what do we do when we find ourselves in a season of darkness? But understanding in those seasons that we have to learn something, and here's something we can learn, is that every suffering is an opportunity. Every suffering is an opportunity. Welcome to Radiant Life Church this morning, right? Like, come on, preach at me, Pastor. Come on, tell me about it, right? We don't want to talk about it. We may all find ourselves, when I say may, we will all find ourselves in a season of suffering at time. Now, those may vary, right? Maybe it's a season of suffering where you've lost a job. Maybe it's a season where you've experienced death of a loved one. Maybe it's a bad diagnosis. Maybe it's financial hardship, possibly a broken relationship, or maybe a failed promise where someone said, oh, this is what I'm going to do, and then they fail on that promise. Here's what I know, here's what you know, is life is tough. And we find ourselves in these seasons of suffering. But when we find ourselves in these seasons, what can we learn? And so we're going to look at the life of Joseph, who finds himself in a season of suffering. And over the last 4 weeks, as we've unpacked this, last week we talked about it, what did he do? He made a stance for purity, and he now finds himself in prison. We may find ourselves in a spot like Joseph one day and realize standing for God, right, and standing for the right thing, we may not be celebrated by man, but we will always be celebrated by God. Right? We may not be celebrated by man, but we will always be celebrated by God. So we're picking up the story of Joseph and his life in Genesis chapter 40, verses 1 through 8 today. And let's go on this journey together. It says, sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh was angry with the two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. Now remember, this is important. Right? They're now in the same prison where Joseph is confined. And now going on, it says the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph. So Joseph is still being used while in prison. It's very important. And he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream on the same night. And each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. And it finishes up this morning. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in the master's house, why do you look so sad today? We both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. Some scholars believe that the time period from when Joseph's brothers sold him to this moment where he finds himself in prison is about a year. I don't know about you, but that sounds like the worst year of my life, right? That's probably what Joseph is walking through. Like, hey, I was doing really good with my brothers, and I was finding favor with my dad, and I got this cool robe, and then I bragged a little bit, and then my brothers didn't like it, and then I was sold into slavery, and now I did the right thing. I stood for God. God had favor with me. I was in charge, and then all of a sudden Potiphar's wife comes in, and I do the right thing, and I stood for purity, and now I'm in prison. And all this happens over about a year period. Now, somewhere in this journey, like when we talked about, he was somewhere between 17 and a half, and now he's in prison at 19. He's about 19 years old. Now, you look at that and you're like, okay, so maybe for a year or two. For over a decade, he's in prison. A decade of suffering, a decade of finding himself going, I'm in the prime of my life. Right? From 19 to 29, I'm in the prime of my life, and I'm imprisoned for doing the right thing. This doesn't sound like a season of suffering. It sounds like a lifetime of suffering. Like this is what we're experiencing. Like some of you watched a fight just the other day of someone who was in the prime of their life and someone who was not in the prime of their life. Right? I was like, don't fall, Mike. We all wanted Mike to win, but Mike didn't win. He's not in his prime. But Mike in his prime, you didn't want to get hit by Mike in his prime. So Joseph's in his prime, like what's life? This is the life, God, that you have chosen for me? This season of suffering is an opportunity? Really? Really? It doesn't feel like an opportunity. It feels more like suffering. But every suffering is an opportunity. Maybe this season of setbacks and suffering is a setup for what is to come. Did you ever think that? The season that you're in of suffering is a setup for what's to come. That God has a bigger purpose with your life, a bigger reason why you're going through. And so this morning, we're going to continue to look at Joseph's life and go, okay, what can we learn from Joseph and apply to our life? And here's the first thing. Your season doesn't have to make sense for it to be significant. Joseph is in prison. This probably feels a lot less like significance and more like suffering. Like this is God, this is not what you had for me. But is it possible he's working behind the scenes? Is he showing and proving something that you didn't even know it? Now remember, I said it was very important for us to look at where Joseph was imprisoned. Okay, because it's very important where he landed. Because in Egyptian culture, right, you can still see it today. Egyptian culture was very sophisticated. I mean, look at the pyramids. I mean, the design, the architecture, the way that they were able to build those, and for us to be able to still see it thousands of years later, right, is crazy. It's a very sophisticated culture. And when you read throughout the Old Testament, you don't see many mentions of prisons. They didn't use them. Egypt was one of the few nations that was using them. In the Old Testament, you read, oh, you did a crime, you get punished. You were either beaten or killed. Like, oh, this is what happened. You're guilty, and now we're just going to repay for whatever, right? And you see this in the New Testament. Oh, you were taught eye for eye, tooth for tooth, right? Whatever you did, your punishment's going to fit that crime. Well, now Joseph finds himself in an Egyptian prison. Now, in the Egyptian prison, they would punish you for your crime, but then they went a step further. Remember, it's sophistication. It's a different part of society. And so now what they would do is they would take those prisons and it would feel like of an education. So they would turn them into a school. So what you thought you were going to prison for, you would actually, you would find the punishment and then you would find the reprogramming. Because the Egyptian culture was going, hey, when we release them, what do we want to release them to? Well, we want to teach them our traditions. We want to teach them our culture. We want them to understand who we are and what we're about. So again, if you look in Genesis chapter 39, verse 20, it says Joseph was put into the prison as the king's prisoners with all the other king's prisoners. So could the education system that God wanted Joseph to have was all for the next promotion that he was going to give him? So a season of suffering turned into a season of purpose? Like you were put into this prison so that you would have the culture, the tradition, and the understanding of the Egyptians, because one day I'm going to use you, Joseph, and you will be in second in command. And we'll get to that in the next 2 weeks. So God's taking this season of suffering to prepare Joseph for a season of promotion. He's going to use his experiences to prepare him for what is to come. So is it possible that God used the prison to prepare him for the palace? And I wonder if that's where you find yourself today. You feel like, man, I'm being imprisoned, and God's like, I understand it and I know it, but I'm gonna use it, and out of that prison will become purpose. And I'm not saying it feels good. Trust me, I am not up here saying that. Even this week felt a little, like, I'm not gonna go into any detail, but it was like, are we for real? I found out this week that there are some things that drive me nuts. One is poor customer service. It's people who double park. But I found the one thing that annoys me more than anything else. You ready for it? This is so childish. It is. I'm admitting it. I'm child. I'm a 49-year-old child. I have probably made, I don't even know how many hundreds of trips to either the Cleveland Clinic or Rainbow Babies Hospital downtown Cleveland. And that's where I found myself driving back and forth 4 to 5 days this week. And when you pull into the parking garage and people double park in the parking garage, I am here to see precious cargo called my daughter. Park right, people! Like, I don't need to drive to the 10th floor to find a spot because 70 of them were double parked. So I found out that that's me, okay? So judge me all you want, but that's a pet peeve of mine that I can't get past. And I share that, like, it feels like there's weeks, it feels like there's seasons where you're suffering and God's like, listen, but I have a reason for it. Romans 5, verses 3 through 5 says this: not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings. That's hard. I don't know about you, but that's hard. Okay, God, I'm so grateful. I feel blessed, Lord. Thank you so much for this season of suffering. But why do we bring glory? Because we know that suffering produces perseverance, character, and character hope. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So it's in the midst of the suffering that we get perseverance and then character and hope. And the hope is that we have the power and presence of Jesus within us through the power of the Holy Spirit. You see, it's the valley, not the mountaintop, where we experience our most defining and developing moments. Instead of asking why is this happening? Maybe we should ask a different question. Maybe we should be asking ourselves, God, what are you trying to teach me? Where are you leading me? What can I learn from you in this season? Or where can I even look in this season? Like, I think it's important for us to know where to look. So where do you look? In this season of suffering, where do you look? I think it's important sometimes to look back. And you're like, Pastor, are you sure? Because in the book of Genesis that we're studying, the life of Joseph, there was another account where someone looked back and they turned to a pillar of salt. Maybe we shouldn't do that. I think we look back because when we take a moment to just hit pause and we look back, we're able to see that God was faithful then, which means he will be faithful now. We see what God had already brought us out of and he will bring us out of again. And so in that season, we go, God, I'm going to look back and see your faithfulness, but we also look forward. Because when we're looking forward, we know that we can see that there is hope in the future. God, this is where you're taking me and this is where you want to use me. So I can look back and see where you've brought me, but I can look forward knowing where you're going to bring me, but I can also look up. I look up because the word says that even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil because you are with me. We look up because God is with us. He has never left us. He's never going to leave us. He's always going to be faithful. And so we look up knowing, God, our hope, our redemption is with you, but we can also look out. And what do I mean by look out? I think it's important for us to look out and go, God, what is it you want to do in this season? Because when you read Psalm 23 that I just quoted, it's important to understand this very important word, even though I walk. It doesn't say, even though I run through the valley. Too many of us are trying to get out of a season of suffering, and we want to run out instead of walk out. Like, God, I know you're with me, but I want my plan to prevail in this system. Like, I don't know about you, like, if I ever get sick, I just want the 24-hour bug. Like, I don't want the 36-hour, I don't want the 72-hour, I don't want the 7-day, I don't want the hospitalist, I want the 24-hour bug, and I want to just come, go, be done with it, and I'm fine in 24 hours. And I feel like in our seasons of suffering, that's what we want. God, just 24 hours. I will learn what I need to learn. I will process what I need to process. I will look back, I will look forward, I will look up, and I will look out, but can you get me out of it as quickly as possible? And God's like, I want you to walk. And I want you to walk in this season, but I want you to know that I'm walking with you because I'm beside you. What if God is refining you for your next assignment? Think about that. What if God is refining you for your next assignment? So in the season of suffering, we can also learn another thing from Joseph, and it's this: work while you wait. Work while you wait. So Joseph, I'm sure Joseph had dreamed before, but now God has a new assignment where he is interpreting this dream. And maybe Joseph needs to do some work in the valley that will prepare him for the mountaintop. And maybe that's where God has you, to work out some things in the valley to prepare you for the next season of the mountaintop. And so how do we work? We work on our strengths, but I think you also have to work on your weakness. Did you know that God is not erasing your past, but using your past to propel you into your future? He's not erasing it, he's going to use it. So my question is, where is God working? And how do you walk or work alongside where God is already at? God, why do you have me in this season? Because no season is ever wasted. God doesn't waste anything, he uses it. Here's how I know. You ready? This would have been a number of years ago, and I say a long time ago, probably 2 decades ago, where Angel and I were not on staff at a church, we were just volunteers. We were volunteers and we wanted to get plugged in, and so we were serving in what felt like at the time, maybe every ministry. But there was a moment where the church where we were volunteering at bought a large piece of property. They had purchased 30 acres from a family that sold it to them very cheap. And they were going to build a building and ball fields and had this big master plan. And it was in that season where I was like, well, I want to help. What can I do? And so they're like, well, we're going to plant grass. And I was like, you mean the landscaper is going to plant grass? And they were like, oh no, the church is going to plant grass and save some money. I was like, okay, well, I can help. And so we planted some grass seed, and then we put straw. And while we were throwing straw through a machine that someone let us borrow, it caught on fire. It was a great moment. And now we're burning grass instead of planting grass. And then the pastor was like, well, we have to water the grass. We planted 15 acres of grass, and now we have to water it. Yeah, you know where I'm going with this. So we bought every garden hose in Medina County. We bought a pump to put into the retention pond that we would pump water out to be able to water 15 acres of grass by hand with sprinklers. And so we would go out every hour, move all the hoses, move the sprinklers, turn off the pump, turn it back on, and then we go back, and then it was all this for weeks. And I was like, this season doesn't make any sense. But sometimes I feel like what we want is we want a platform, right? Because we want to be able to stand on something and have significance. Can I just let you know, moving those hoses was very significant in my life. It had a purpose in my life. That it doesn't matter what you do for the kingdom of God, whether it's standing in a parking lot or preaching on a stage, both are impactful and meaningful. Because the best way to serve God is by serving other people. Right? And so I learned in that moment. Well then, sure enough, it's that same exact church that brought Pastor Angel and I on staff as youth pastors. And we were there, I was on youth pastor for about 6 years, and then I became associate pastor for about 4.5. Well, that next season, This is what happened when I became associate pastor. I don't know if my mindset changed or what, but the lead pastor was like, hey, I want you to lead the building committee. And I was like, okay, I can do it. That was a big deal. I'm gonna be in charge of people. And I had people on my team. Now understand, what that meant was I had a ton of meeting with architects. I had tons of meetings with builders. I was traveling and having all these other companies come in from other states, and they were presenting projects, and this is what we'd like to do, and here's price, and let's talk about design. And then we did this whole scope analysis where we sat down with ministries in the church, and what are the needs, and let's get some data. What do we need to move forward? And I did all this, it was awesome, all this crazy work. Developed all these neat relationships. And then 4.5 years after being the associate, we knew it was time for us to become lead pastors, and God brought us to Wadsworth, which was amazing. But what I felt in that season was that was a waste of my time. I did all that work and all that effort, and we never built a building, and I never got to use any of that. I was like, God, I don't understand it. I could have spent more time with people instead of meetings and drawings and looking at schematics and all. It was cool, but for nothing? That's how I felt, for nothing. And then I showed up. So we celebrated 13 years last week, right, being at Radiant Life Church. So I showed up to my first board meeting. I hadn't even preached a sermon yet, but I showed up to my first board meeting. And I didn't put the agenda together. Somebody else even put the agenda together. And I showed up, and we're walking through the agenda, and I'm looking at all the financials of all the money we don't have, and I was like, bless God. It's so good to be here. And then we get to the last item on the agenda. And the gentleman who was leading the board meeting was like, hey, we need to talk about this offer that we got from McDonald's. And I was like, they're giving us free Big Macs on Sundays? What kind of offer are we talking about? And then he goes, oh, no, they want to buy our building. And I was like, why didn't anybody tell me this before I said yes to the job? Shouldn't I have known this? So some of you on the board and some of you are in here today, right now. You did not tell me. You know what I'm saying? Right? You know what? I was pointing at Hal, Hal called out. But I was like, okay, so what does this mean? What is this? Oh, they want to buy it. What do they want to do? They want to knock the church down and put up a McDonald's. And I was like, okay, this could be can I negotiate part of this contract? I get free Mickey D's for life if you buy this land? What are we talking? Well, that led us to, McDonald's never bought it. If you know, they knocked down their building, built their own. But that led us to, is this a season for us to sell our property? It wasn't our idea, but it was okay, is this new season? Well, from the time we started at the job to the time we put it on the market, here's what we found out. The building needed probably about $400,000 worth of work. The old building did. It needed new siding. The siding was falling off the building. It was bad. Needed new fencing, air conditioners. They were put in and should not have been working, but bless God, they were still working, right? And so it was we see all this. Actually, there was a bathroom that the old clay tile collapsed in, and it went through the middle of the sanctuary to get to the sewer system. And they were like, hey, it's gonna be about 20 grand to fix that. And I was like, nope, bathroom not working, right? We just put closed and just shut the door, no big deal. Because we didn't wanna fix it. Because we'd had to rip up all the carpet, all the pews, to put new carpet back in. And it was what are we doing? So we put the building on the market. And sure enough, it sold. It sold, and now here we are 9 years later in this beautiful facility. And if you like shopping at Aldi or you like getting your gas at Get-Go or maybe a little snack, you're welcome. We made that happen for you, okay? And so, but needless to say, God orchestrated that. And not only did he orchestrate it, somebody paid us a lot of money for dirt. And we built this entire building debt-free and didn't ask anybody for a penny. There was no building campaign. It was God's favor. Now, why do I say all that? 20 years prior, I met a guy when I was just moving sprinklers by the name of Jeff Craven, because he was putting in some curbing at the church where I was moving sprinklers. And then he put a bid in when I was talking to contractors to build a new building where I was the associate pastor at. And did you know, sure enough, when we got here and I found all that out and we sold our property, I reached out to him and I called him. I said, hey, you still building churches? And he was like, yeah, sure am. Well, you thinking about building one? I was like, well, we're going to have no choice because we're not going to have a place to meet. And we met with him. Now understand, I had already met with 5, 6 other builders. And so when it came time to design and to build this facility, we didn't really look for other places because I'd already spent years doing that. So we just went with Craven Construction. And people have told me, listen, when you build this building, just so you know, you're budget 10% over because that's the way it's gonna work, and it's always gonna cost more and it's always gonna take more time. Can I let you know, on this entire project, we went about $13,000 over budget, and that was it. That $13,000, by the way, was because we made changes. Had nothing to do with the builder. Under budget for this entire project. And it came in on time, and we were ready for Christmas 9 years ago. Right? Why do I share that? Because what I thought was a waste, what I thought was, this makes no sense to me, God was going, oh, but you don't see it. Because in the future, at some point, you're gonna need all of this training, all of this wisdom, and the relationships that were built to be able to move Radiant Life Church to where I want Radiant Life Church to go. That was God moving behind the scenes, and what I thought was wasted, God never wastes. So you have to be willing to work. You got to be willing to put in the effort. Just don't work on your strength, work on your weakness. Did you know we're not as strong as our greatest strength, but we are as weak as our greatest weakness? Weakness can either be used as an excuse to fail or a reason to surrender. Like, no, I don't want to do this. This doesn't make any sense. And God's like, it doesn't make sense now, but it will make sense into the future. Because I can look back and be like, God, look what you did and look how you arranged it. And I'm so grateful for how he provided in what I thought was a season of suffering. So while we're working, we also find out this from Joseph, is we can't win alone. Did you know Joseph thrived in prison because of the relationship with God, but also with the relationship of the leadership within the prison? Genesis 39:21, it says, the Lord was with Joseph and gave him favor with the warden. Did you know that God builds his kingdom via relationships? Let that sink in for a moment. God builds his kingdom via relationships. First with him and then one another. It's why we built the mission of the church. It's a real relationship with God and a real relationship with each other. It starts with surrendering to God, saying, God, I want a real authentic relationship with you. I don't want one that's just based on surface. I just don't want you to get to know you a little bit. I want to get to know you a lot. I want to know your plans for my life, and I want to be able to ask and find that wisdom from you. But here's what I know about relationships. Relationships that work take work. Marriages fail when there's no effort. Friendships fail when there's no effort. Families fail when there's no effort. Our faith is defined by a relationship and not by a religion. Right? When Christ came and gave his life and he reconciled us back to the Father, it wasn't with a list of rules, it was with a relationship. And so we have to be willing to put in the work with that relationship because we cannot win alone. We need each other. We are better together. So what did Jesus do to stay connected with the relationship with his Father? He put in time, place, and a plan. In Mark 1:35, it says Jesus got up early to pray. And you'll see all in the New Testament, that was normal for Jesus to get up and to go pray. What was he doing? He was having a time. I would encourage all of you to put something on your calendar, a time. This is when I'm gonna meet with God. If you're a morning person, be a morning person. If you're an evening person, be an evening person. But be willing to put on, God, I'm gonna spend time with you in your word. I'm gonna spend time with you in worship. I'm gonna spend time with you in prayer. If that's what Jesus did, then maybe we need to follow his model. See, goals aren't accomplished in a day, but through a daily commitment. Right? You want to get closer to God? It's not like, well, God, I just spent a half hour with you. Well, spend a half hour a day for a full month and see how you feel. Because I know it will happen. You're going to get closer because you're putting aside some time for him. And then he also had a place. Luke 22:39, it was common for Jesus to find a place to connect with God. So find a place. Find a place in your house. Maybe you have a prayer closet. Maybe you have a prayer room. Maybe it's your dining room table. Maybe it's a local coffee shop. Find a place where you can connect with God. Maybe it's creation. Here's what I found out. If I just go outside and take a walk, I meet with God every time. It's like I was just really, all of creation is screaming your glory if I will just look up and look out and see it. So you find a time, you find a place, but then you also got to find a plan. Make a plan. The Lord's Prayer is in Matthew chapter 6. And what do you see in this plan? It's so powerful. So if Jesus had a time and he had a place and a plan, then maybe it's time for us to have a time, a place, and a plan. Joseph leaned into his relationship with God and with others. Did you know the closer that you get with God, the better friend you're gonna be? Did you know the closer that you get to God, the better father, the better wife you're gonna be? Do you know that the closer you get to God, the better worker you're gonna be? The better parent you're gonna be? People are like, hey, tell me, like, your kids seem to be doing really well. My daughters are amazing. I love them. I brag on them all the time. I always say, despite me, they turned out great. That's because they have an amazing mother. That's what you need to do. Just find an amazing mom, and then you can fail. No, I'm just kidding. But here's what happened is the closer I got to God, the better shot I had at being a better dad. Like, God, I need to have more patience with these girls. Do you know who can help you in your area of patience? God. And so the closer I got to God, the more patience that I was able to have to know, oh, this is a big deal. Like, because I don't understand why it takes a half hour to be in the shower. We have one hot water tank. But here's what happened. No joke. It's one of the worst jobs on planet Earth. But I did it. And I could have grumbled every time I did it. But I found myself being grateful. Dad, shower drain, it's clogged again. Again? Yep, all right. Go to the garage, get my little zip stick tool, right? And I would get all this nasty hair. And some of you are like, you're disgusting. It was disgusting. 3 daughters. But I was grateful. I was grateful that I had 3 daughters who called me dad. It wasn't a burden, it was a blessing. They were there, they were safe. And in those seasons, it reminded me that they were healthy. And so you have to look for that, and you got to be saying, okay, God, I want to get close to you so I can be. So how do we get close to God? James 4:8 says, come near to God and he will come near to you. Did you know today is a great day to reach out to him? If there is distance in your relationship with God, can I just tell you, he hasn't left, but you may have drifted. Because he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He hasn't gone anywhere. But maybe we've drifted away, and today's a great day to not drift back, but to run back, to walk back. Today is a great day. If you found yourself bound, that you find freedom. If you're like, man, I walked in bound, but I want to leave free. Today is a great day to do that. Because if you will come near to God, he will. He will. It doesn't say he may, he possibly. If you only bring him certain things, if you bring him a sacrifice, then he will come. No, if you come near to God, if you do your part, he will do his part. And so however you walked in today, you can leave different. If you say, God, I just want to come near to you. So no matter the season that you find yourself in, as long as God is with you, you win. If God's with you, you win. So not only did Jesus stay connected to the Father, but he stayed connected in relationships with others. He had the 12 disciples. Jesus gave of himself. So throw up the next slide. What if I told you today that I would love to deposit into your bank account every single day for the rest of your life, $1,440? How many of you want signed up now? Come on, somebody. Like, do it. Won't he do it, right? Like, deposit those funds. But here's the caveat. You have to spend every single penny because you don't get to roll it over. So every day we're going to dump this money, but you got to spend it. How many can spend $1,440 a day? Like, oh, I got this. I'll spend it. Like, I'm going to buy me a car and just pay on the principal every day. I'm going to buy me a fat house and I'll just pay on the principal every day. Like, my sneaker game will go up a few levels because I won't shop sales. I'll shop whatever I want. Like, it's next level. But you would feel confident spending that if it was given to you. You would feel confident in utilizing it if it was given to you. Did you know that every day you are given 1,440 minutes of life? You cannot roll over the time, but you can utilize the time that you are given every day to invest into others, to have others invest into you. But are you utilizing, it's the greatest commodity that we have. It's not money. You can make more money, but you cannot make more time. And so how will you utilize the time that God has given you? So will you invest in others? Will you allow others to invest in you? We already talked about life groups. Life groups are amazing. I'll just make another plug for it. Get in a life group. Life groups is, we do life together. We just don't talk about the sermon, but we pray together. We get to know each other. How do you did you know that there was a whole nother group that already listened to this sermon at 9 o'clock and you're here at the 11? And you're like, I don't even know half the church. How do you make a large church small? Life groups. We have about 16 homes that are packed And you're like, well, is there room for me? Here's the deal. Don't be mad, Pastor Emily. Sign up for a life group. You're like, is there room? We'll make room. We'll find more people to open up their homes, because that's how important relationships with each other are. I would rather go into my office, bring in our whiteboard, and have to destroy every life group to reconfigure it to make space for you. Because that's how much I believe in making sure that you have a healthy relationship with Jesus and you have relationships with each other. Because you will be in seasons of suffering where you're like, God, I need you to walk with me, but I also need you to put somebody in my presence that will hold my hand. And so I need somebody else to walk with me. That's why we do it. We want to make sure, God, we're putting you first. So work on your relationships. Work on your relationship with God. Work on relationships with each other. And so here's what we want to do today. We want to provide an opportunity for you to have some strategic time to connect with God. That's why we set up the service this way. Because now you're processing. And now you're like, okay, so what are we going to do? Here's what we're going to do. We don't want you to go through your season of suffering alone. God's with you. He's with you. He sees you. But not only do we spiritually not want you to go through it alone, but even today, maybe you came in and you're weary and you're like, I just need rest. Here's what I'm asking. Oftentimes on the third Sunday, which is today, we take some time and we have our staff and our board, our leaders come forward and we pray. So that's what I'm gonna ask them to do, to come on up and to line up front here at the altars. The scripture says in the book of James, if anyone among you is sick, would you call on the elders of the church, and with the anointing of oil and the laying on of hands, would you pray with them? And you may find yourself here going, man, I'm physically doing really well. I don't really need anybody to pray for me. I didn't ask just about your physical self. Do you feel like you need rest? Are you tired? Are you weary? Physically, maybe you're like, man, I'm walking through some things. I got some pain in my body, but maybe spiritually you feel disconnected. Did you know that this is not a judgment zone up front? I can't be vulnerable. There's no way I could tell this person what I'm walking through. Can I just let you be honest for a moment? Did you know that everybody up here has walked through seasons of hardship? That everybody up here has walked through seasons in their life where it's like, man, how'd they get through it? I'm not saying I want you to experience this season, but how many years have you guys been married? 10, almost 10 years. That's a long time to put up a Craig, you know what I'm saying? That's a long, but 10 years. 10 years. I love that. But what you don't know is the season of suffering that both of these had to walk through. And I'm not sharing their story. I would love for you to sit down and ask them about their story. But if you ask them their story, you're gonna find out that a wife walked out and left. What do? You're gonna find out that Jen walked with her husband through battles of cancer. And that battle, he lost. And as a single mom taking care of 2 amazing daughters, what do I do in a season of suffering? But 10 years later, here we are. And you wouldn't even notice, you wouldn't even know the suffering. These 2 actually love each other. They really do, right? And it's great. And you're like, they're amazing. And they serve on your board. And Jen directs your preschool. And she's awesome at it. But you're like, how did they get through it? Ask them. Ask them. Ask them if they learned anything. And you're like, man, I hope I don't have to walk that. I hope you don't have to walk it either. But if you find yourself feeling that, like, man, I feel that rejection. I feel that loneliness. Who am I supposed to talk to? There are people up front that want to talk to you, that want to pray with you. There is no judgment. And I just want you to know today, we're going to sing in just a minute. And when we start singing, I'm going to encourage you. I'm going to pray. Stand to your feet. Worship. But if you're like, man, I want someone to pray with me, we're going to be up here and we're going to pray for you. And maybe you're like, this place is going to look like Walmart on Black Friday. Wait in line. We're gonna get to every single person because we don't want you to feel like you're going through this alone. Because here's what I know is gonna happen today. God is going to show up. He didn't just show up at the 9 and go, I forgot about the 11. I didn't know. You should have told me. You needed more information on your website. I would have been here. No, he's here. And he's gonna meet you. He's gonna meet you in the midst of that season of suffering, and he's gonna show up and he's gonna speak life into you. And you're like, man, I didn't think I could have a peace. And you're gonna experience a peace. Man, I never thought I could find freedom. We celebrated this morning, the 9 a.m. that guys, we're holding up a sign. of sobriety, from alcohol addiction for decades. He's sober today. He found it in Jesus, and you can find it too. But we want to walk alongside you as well. God's gonna show up, but we want you to know we're here for you too. So in a moment of vulnerability, just be uncomfortable. Get up out of your seat and say, I need it. And even if you're like, I don't need prayer, get up out of your seat and worship. Or if you feel comfortable, right where you're at, that's okay too, because God's gonna meet you. But I'm gonna pray, and then we're gonna worship. Jesus, thank you that we can be vulnerable with you today. Thank you that we can learn from Joseph. Thank you we can learn from you, Jesus, that you suffered. And we can learn from you. And so in this season of suffering, God, I pray today that you would meet with each and every one of us, that you would speak and breathe life. And today we wouldn't want to run out of this moment, but we would walk through the valley because you are with us. And God, remind us today that you're with us, that you are not going anywhere. And in this season, I pray, God, that we would be willing in these next few moments to draw near to you, and you will draw near to us, and you will meet us this day. Our lives will be marked, they will be changed, they will be transformed because of your power, because of your presence in our lives. And God, I pray that you would help us today to have faith as we pray, to believe for the miraculous, to believe that you are bigger than whatever obstacle may be in front of us. So today, God, I pray that you would help us to see our suffering as an opportunity to seek you. So all over this place, would you just stand to your feet? Would you lift your hands? Would you open your mouth? Would you sing? Would you worship? Would you spend time with God? And would you be vulnerable enough to make your way down front? Say, God, meet me.